Hello folks, once again it's me with a daily update for my Game in a Week project. Today, I worked on several things. Now yesterday I already programmed the basic player movement, and a little bit of stuff on the enemy's projectiles, like little bullets, and a little bit about how they would move in one pattern. Now, what I did today was a lot more general. I added enemy objects, and I wrote the collision code, just the general collision code for, enemies and their projectiles hitting the player, and just, the player, firing a bullet and that hitting an enemy. And I did that using things called inheritance and signals. And what these will allow me to do is they allow me to just quickly set up basic collision detection between all the different objects I want to, and then later I can fill in code to delete objects or increment score, whatever else I want to do when these collisions happen. So let's talk about it a little bit. Inheritance. What is inheritance? Well, in programming, inheritance is kind of what we think inheritance is normally. You have an object, and then you have a child object. Now let's say the big object, the parent object, has properties square, triangle, and circle. What does that mean? Well, since the child object inherits from the parent object, by default the child has properties square, triangle, and circle. And what's more, you can define other properties as well, like star or pentagon, that you can apply to the child object and not to the parent object. Or alternatively, something else you could do is you can sometimes remove some properties of the parent object, like here I remove circle. And what you can do is you have objects that share in some of the same behaviors as their parents, but can also have their own specialized behaviors. And you can create many different children from a single parent, all of which have, different features that can affect the objects in their own ways. Like this one has triangle, circle, and hexagon. And inheritance is often used in programming, and game program especially, because it helps you, avoid redundancy in code. If you had, a bunch of different enemy objects, and you wanted the player to collide with them, you'd have to write specific code for each and every one. But if you had a parent over all of them, then you can just put the center code that you want shared between all of the enemies in the parent, and it will just execute automatically. And that's what I did, basically. When the player... So basically, all the enemies in my game are children of an enemy basic node. And what the enemy basic node is set up to do is just when an enemy basic node, collides with the player, it would take off a life, it would sort of reset the game a little bit. Like a standard game like Xevious would do. And because all of the other enemies inherit behavior from that enemy basic, whenever you collide with any of the actual enemies on screen, it does the exact same thing. Hey. And I think that's pretty cool. So, that's something I've been toying around with. It took me a little while. Inheritance works a little bit differently in Godot than it did in Game Maker Studio. In Game Maker Studio, inheritance was a lot easier to set up. It was just click a checkbox and you know what's parent of what and what else. But it also got confusing easily. In Godot, just sometimes the language is a little bit different. Sometimes the documentation is a little bit hard to find what I'm looking for, but once I figured out how to do it, it was very helpful, and that's something that's going to be super useful in the future. I plan to make several more different. I made one enemy object that just travels in a straight line down over the screen. No, not interesting, kind of boring, but I plan to make more, and they'll have their own behaviors as well. And because they're all children of the enemy basic, they'll all behave the same if they hit the player with something. So that's inheritance, just briefly explained for computer programming. Very useful. And something else I want to talk about that's like a big driving factor and a big part of making things with Godot. It's something I haven't really seen a whole lot of in other game engines, is a signal system. Now, I'm sure there's other game engines that do have them. Maybe Unity has it, I don't know. Game Maker certainly didn't. In fact, you can buy add-ons, or maybe download a mod someone made for signals. But what is a signal? Well, let's suppose we have the player, right? And the player shoots an enemy, and the enemy goes boop. Now you want to increase the score, right? How do you do that? In something like Game Maker, you would have to use lots of global variables and stuff in order to do stuff like this. And sometimes that could be a little confusing because global variables can be accessed anywhere in the program and they can be manipulated in a lot of different ways. But something you can do in Godot is emit a signal. And basically a signal is just like when the enemy goes pop, when that collision event with the laser happens, you can just broadcast a little signal. It just basically says an enemy died. It just sends that out to all the other objects present. And the laser and the player and other enemies, they don't have any code for that situation. They don't pick up the signal. It doesn't matter to them that an enemy died. But to the score counter, it does matter. And when it receives that signal, since it's being broadcast to it, it will increase the score. And that's basically what a signal does. Basically, just like some sort of event occurs, you program your little object to emit the signal, and it just goes to all the other objects present. And whatever objects can receive the signal are programmed to do something when they receive it, can perform their own actions on demand. And that's really helpful for various things. And and that can be really useful for score updates or live updates. Really just general variable manipulation for things like lives, score, stuff like that. That's really useful. You can use it to check if things are still around, or if things have been destroyed, demolished. For example, I use a player hit signal to determine when the game needs to reset a little bit, because, player got damaged. Alternatively, you can have the enemies make a signal, increment score. And there's other uses too. Maybe there's things with power-ups that you want to do. Or something else I programmed. Our player is going to have an outer hitbox called a graze box and an inner hitbox called a hitbox. If something hits the hitbox, you're damaged and you lose a life. If something hits the graze box, you get bonus points, because that takes a little bit of extra skill for it to not hit the hitbox, that is. So, what I can do is just whenever a projectile or an enemy hits the graze box, it can emit a signal, and that will do a score update as well. And you can have all sorts of different signals controlling all sorts of different behaviors. And that's just crazy useful for things like a stealth game. If you want to have an alarm that puts all the guards on alert, you can do that. If you have a puzzle game and you want to change all the one type, let's say it's Candy Crush, you want to change all the one types of candies to other kinds of candies, you can do that too. All you need is a signal for it. And that's just it's just a really interesting change in workflow from what I'm used to, and I think it's really helpful. But yeah, that's some stuff that I've done today. I've constructed a way to, like, for the ship to fire the bullets. I've made basic enemy types. I made a specific basic enemy that can be put into the game. And I've written up, like, all the collision detection for the player and the enemies and their bullets and my bullet with the enemies. Yeah, that's about everything for right now. Not sure what I'm planning on doing tomorrow. I'm thinking either I'm going to start, like, making a GUI, like a HUD, or maybe just fleshing out, like, scores and just, like, general, like, update things like I would for score and live systems and all that. See ya.